Our last year in Romania, our last November there, our last Thanksgiving week there, we had the opportunity to go to a missionary retreat in Rothenburg, Germany. We drove from eastern Romania to western Romania, Rachel and the girls and I did. And there in Arad, in western Romania, Oradea rather, we joined up with some Christians, some Romanian Christians, and we had 2 church bands, and a group of us, maybe about 9 or 10, 12. We drove up to Budapest, Hungary, got on the Autobahn, and drove to Rothenburg, Germany. That was the week of Thanksgiving. We enjoyed ourselves there, and then we headed home. Now I want to tell you, you might find this hard to believe, but Rachel actually drove faster on the Autobahn than I did. I would drive about 140 kilometers an hour. She would drive about 155 kilometers an hour. She didn't have a problem putting her foot down on that gas in that van. But anyway, we were driving back. It was about 6 o'clock that evening when we were headed back home. We were going to spend the night there in Oradea again. The next morning, which was Thanksgiving Day, we were going to drive back home to Yash. But we drive into Budapest 6 o'clock that night. We drive around and we can't find our way out of Budapest. Now, the Hungarian language is totally different from the Romanian language. Now, Romanian is a Latin-based language, so it's very close to French or Spanish or Italian. And in fact, yesterday at our booth at the Pumpkin Festival, the woman working at the chiropractor's office in the tent, the booth right next to us, was from Romania. And she met Jessica and Sid yesterday morning. They told her that their preacher had lived in Romania with his family, so she was all excited about meeting us yesterday afternoon. So we stood there and talked in Romanian for a while. She hadn't spoken Romanian since 2004. So she was excited to speak her mother tongue. But anyway, Romanian is a completely different language from Hungarian. So when we stopped to ask for directions, and I think we drove for an hour before we stopped asking for directions because Romanian men don't like to ask for directions either. But somebody told us how to get out of Budapest, and so we followed their directions, and we were still lost. And we stopped off the second time and asked for directions, and we tried to follow those directions. There was one of the Romanians who could speak some Hungarian, but apparently he couldn't speak it very well. But anyway, we still couldn't get out of Budapest. Finally, about 8:30, we stopped off at a gas station. The Romanian driver went in. He was trying to find out, once again, how to get out of Budapest. And there was a taxi driver there who overheard him asking for directions. And he said, if you will get in your van and follow me, I will take you out to the road that actually goes to the airport. But he said, you get on that road and it'll take you to the Autobahn, and then you can get back to Romania from there. So we drove around in Budapest, Hungary for 3 hours. Have you ever been in a situation where you needed somebody to tell you what to do? What to do? Jesus came from heaven to earth to show us the way. And that's why He emphasizes to us in His Word that we have got to follow His voice. So this morning I want us to focus our minds and our hearts on that passage from John chapter 10. So turn in your Bibles to John chapter 10, verses 1 through 10. If you're using the Bible in the pew, it's page 896. Now John chapter 10 follows on the heels of a miracle that Jesus performed in John chapter 9. And the miracle that Jesus performs in John chapter 9, He performs that miracle in order for us to believe what He said in John chapter 10. The miracle He does in John chapter 9 is that He makes a blind man to see. Now the Jews thought at that time that if something bad happens to you, then it's because you've sinned against God. The book of Job clearly tells us in the Old Testament that that's not true, but even today a lot of people have that mentality. If something bad's happened to me, it's because I'm not pleased with God. But that's not true at all. In this particular situation, Jesus tells his apostles in verse 3, he says, this man was allowed to be born blind so that the works of God could be revealed to you. In other words, so that I can show you who I am. And so Jesus healed the man of his blindness. The Jewish leaders, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, did not like this at all. They had been for about 3 years losing their popularity to Jesus. People flocked to Jesus like they would not flock to the Pharisees. Obviously, if he could heal the blind and raise the dead and cure the sick and all of that, then he draws crowds. The Pharisees didn't like that. Plus, Jesus would not toe the line with the Pharisees' traditions. They had elevated their traditions to the same level as the Word of God, and Jesus said, I'm not going to go there. And so the Pharisees hated him for it. So when the Pharisees see this man born blind, they would not accept the fact that Jesus is the one who did it. They even went to the man's parents. And we get the idea that this individual was a man. I don't think it tells us how old he was. We get the picture that he is a mature man. But they go to his parents. And they said, was this man born blind? And they said, how he came to see now, we don't know. You'll have to ask him. But whether or not he was born blind, we can verify that. He was born blind. Pharisees came to the man and said, who made you able to see? The man says, that man called Jesus. Well, he can't do that because he's a sinner. And the man who had been blind said, well, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. But nobody's ever been made to see. That's not a miracle that happened in the Old Testament. He said, I can tell you this, that man made me to see. Now look at the end of chapter 9 and look at this interchange between Jesus and this man that goes on in the presence of the Pharisees. In verse 35, we find out that because this man who had been blind refused to give up the idea that Jesus is the one who healed him, the Pharisees kicked him out of the synagogue. In other words, they excommunicated him. They withdrew fellowship from him. They refused to allow him to come worship God in the temple anymore. So Jesus goes and finds him in verse 35. He said, do you believe in the Son of Man? The blind man says, well, I don't know who he is. And Jesus says in verse 37, you have both seen him, and he is the one who's talking with you. And the man who had been blind said, yes, Lord, I believe, verse 38. And so Jesus responds in verse 39, he says, this is the reason why I came into the world. I came into the world to make a distinction between those people who think they see, and yet are blind, and those people who are blind but want to see. He says in verse 39, for judgment I came into this world so that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may become blind. Well, the Pharisees were listening to this discussion, this interchange there, and they say in verse 40, we are not blind too, are we? So you see, they're using the word blind in two different ways. In one way, he's talking about being blind physically, and now he's talking about being blind spiritually. And they say, we're not blind spiritually, are we? And then he says in verse 41, if you were blind, you would have no sin, but since you say we see, your sin remains. In other words, you are still blind, Jesus says. You're still blind spiritually, because you will not see the facts in front of you that I made this man to see. Well, now, if we get down into chapter 10, Jesus tells us in chapter 10 why we need to follow His voice. We are blind without Jesus Christ. How do we get to heaven? How do we please God? How do we live our lives here on this earth? How do I treat my spouse? How do I treat my children? How do I treat my boss at work? How do I treat my neighbor? How do I treat my enemies? You see, we're blind about all of that without Jesus' help. And so here in John chapter 10, Jesus gives us 4 reasons why we need to follow His voice. And so that's what I want us to focus on this morning. Jesus tells the Pharisees there, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But since you say, I know the way, when you're rejecting me, then your sin remains. So there's a lot of people today who are groping for truth, who are groping for the way to heaven, who are groping for give substance and meaning and a foundation to their life. And you and I, of course, believe that that person is Jesus Christ. And Jesus tells us why here in John chapter 10. First of all, he says we need to follow his voice because his is the only legitimate voice. Look again at what he says in verse 1. Truly, truly, I say to you, Jesus says, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he is a thief and a robber. Now, there's a lot of our family and friends, a lot of people across our country, a lot of people across the world that are trying to go to heaven some other way. They're trying to follow the law of Moses to get to heaven, and that won't work. We're studying that on Wednesday nights. They try to follow Muhammad to get to heaven, and that's not going to work. They try to follow philosophers like Confucius and Mahatma Gandhi to get to heaven, but that won't work. But most people who don't follow the voice of Jesus in order to get to heaven, most people follow their own voice. They follow their own voice. I think I know what I need to do to get to heaven, and I'm not really concerned about what Jesus has to say. That reminds me of the story of 2 Kings chapter 5, where the army commander in Syria named Naaman had his leprosy, and his wife had a slave girl who was an Israelite. And she said, if my master would go to Israel and talk to the prophet of God in Israel, then he would be able to heal my master of his leprosy. Naaman takes a big entourage with him down to Israel to visit the prophet Elisha. He takes lots of gifts to pay the prophet for his gift. And if you've ever read the story, you know Elisha doesn't even come out and talk to him. Elisha sends his servant Gehazi out to talk to him. He tells him to go dip in the Jordan River 7 times. And in verse 11 of that chapter, Naaman rather shows us that at that point he is one of those individuals who doesn't want to follow the voice of God. He wants to follow his own voice. Because if you read the text, Naaman says, behold, I thought. Behold, I thought I knew what to do. I thought I knew a better way. He says the rivers in Syria are a lot better than the river. The Jordan River is a dirty, filthy, muddy river. Well, thankfully, he has some sense talked into him by his lowly servant, and Naaman was able to be cleansed of his leprosy. But he makes that mistake that so many people today make, thinking, I don't have to follow Jesus' voice. And yet Jesus said, I am the only legitimate voice that you need to be listening to in matters of spiritual things and religion. Why? John tells us very early in his gospel, in John chapter 1 and verse 14, that Jesus, before he came to earth, was in the bosom of the Father. Jesus laid his head against the breast of the Father before he came to earth, John says. And Jesus came to explain him. Jesus came to explain the Father. Nobody knows the Father except the Son, Jesus says. No man can come to the Father except the Son draw him, Jesus says in John 6 and verse 46. And in Matthew chapter 11, verse 27, Jesus tells us that nobody knows the Son except the Father, and nobody knows the Father except the Son, and he to whomever the Son reveals him. So we can't come to know God except through Jesus Christ. We can't come to go to heaven except through Jesus Christ. He is the only legitimate voice in matters of religion and spirituality. And so that's the reason why we need to follow His voice. Now you know that our family has a dog. He's a cute little dog. He stands about that tall, good, nice, medium-sized dog. I think he's the dumbest dog in the world. Well, maybe the dumbest dog in Bourbon Acres. I'm just kidding, he's not dumb. He's a pretty smart little dog, but here's why I say he's dumb. Because Dusty will go to anybody